So now we're going to be moving into working with this UX UI exercise and then going into just developing the first basic shapes and also setting up your layers so that you can work on developing the layout and the elemental elements, the basic components and elements of your UX UI design. So I'm back here in Illustrator. I have sized my artboard to fit the screen dimensions of my particular device. And if you are not sure how to start with this, then make sure to review the previous video tutorial. So now I'm going to start working with bringing in and recreating the basic UX UI elements that I'm going to be developing further for this exercise. And I need to take what I have as a starter image. So this is going to be the bitmap image that I have. This is just a screen capture of a interface that I'm wanting to recreate and then also make new changes to for this exercise. And these are going to be available for people to work with. So you're going to be selecting one of these that's listed on the module for this week. So make sure that you are doing that and then also following those instructions that are written in Canvas, because some of these specifics might change, but overall the exercise is going to stay the same. So I have this, and this is a bitmap, so none of these elements are vectorized. So I can't, for instance, just select this bar or select this button and then move it around. So part of this exercise is going to be about looking at these different layouts and of these different apps that you're wanting to develop and then rearrange a little bit, and starting off to just creating these basic elements using a vector program like Illustrator. So this is just my inspiration image. I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to go over to my other file and then paste it. And so this is just so I have something to work from. So I'm going to be developing these different graphics and these different UX UI components based on what I'm seeing here in this screen captured image. So I'm first going to go to my Layers tab, and I'm going to just change this name. You don't all have to do this. We don't look at your Illustrator files, so it's really up to you to organize them and label things and label layers the way that you want to and the way that works best for you. So these are certain specifics that you don't necessarily have to follow, but they might help you stay more organized as these exercises go farther in and get more and more in depth. So I'm just going to call this my screen cap. And I'm going to lock this, so that way I know that no matter what I'm doing in another layer, I'm not going to mess around with this too much. All right, and then I'm going to make a new layer on top of that, and then I'm just going to call this the background. So what I want to do first is I just want to work with this. When I look at these UX UI designs, the way that I tend to divide them up when I'm trying to recreate these components or draw these components as vector images is I try to separate out all these different elements. So I look at this text, I look at these different buttons and all these different components, and I say, okay, so these are all things, they're working with transparency, some of these are just outlined, and but these are all these separate elements. So I tend to work with a couple of different layers and I divide things up. And so the first thing I look at is the background. And that is something that I've had some questions about in the past with Illustrator, because there is a way to change the color of a background. So default is just this white, and that is to approximate white paper. And there are ways to change the background color in Illustrator so that your artboard itself is a different color. But those are actually things that don't necessarily export the way that you would expect them to, because it's more for approximating how things might print on a different colored paper, or mostly for those types of things, or how something might look on a transparency. So when you're working with background and you're working with something that's going to be exported for the screen, like what we're doing in these exercises, you actually want to just think about the background as its own layer and just as a shape or a fill. So a rectangle that takes up the whole artboard that has a different fill applied to it. So I'm going to start this process by mostly approximating what I'm seeing here. And I see here that there is this background that is pretty much consistent. It's a slight gradient, so it goes from what looks like to be a darker gray into a slightly lighter gray. So that's all I'm going to do for this first step. So I'm going to go to my rectangle tool and I'm going to draw that around the entire space of the artboard. And the reason why it's not showing any change is because that background was set to be white. Then I'm going to go over here and select this fill and see that it is, well actually let me go over here to the color palette that I have. And then I'm going to go to my eyedropper tool and just try to get what this gray is. Let's see, I'm going to try and get it there. All right, so I just approximated this background to be the middle gray here. And if I wanted to go a step further and try to play with that gradient, I could do that. And I will do that just to show this tool because I know it's something we haven't really talked about. So the gradient tool is this little icon that shows the gradient from left to right over here in the left toolbar. And so if I select this, and as long as I have an object selected that has a fill applied to it, I can then just using the gradient tool, I can then set it to apply the gradient. So right now I just clicked down at the bottom because that's where I want that gradient's end to be. And then I'm going to go up to about the midpoint because that's where I want the other transition of color to be. Oh, and okay, that's not working. So let's try that again. Okay, all right. So just kidding. Maybe that only happens when you have a gradient selected already. So instead, let's do that again. And I'm just going to select this once, and now I have the default gradient applied to it. So there are ways to change this. And once you have applied a gradient as the fill to an object, then you can then go and change it more. So this is the default that's set up. It's this horizontal gradient, which means that it's going from left to right instead of top to bottom. That would be a vertical gradient. If you want to change that, which we do want to for this example, you will go over to the right-hand side. So the gradient will default to start from the left and then go to the right and extend the entire length of your selected object. So in order to change that, you go over to that right-hand side where that gradient is ending, and then you can actually, the cursor changes to that little rotate, and then you can come over here and then change the rotation. So now the gradient is starting from the center and it is then extending, and it's actually extending past this. So in order to change this, you can select that little, almost as if it is its own little point, and technically it is, and that's the way that Illustrator is interpolating these tools. Let me zoom in on this a little bit more. You can then use this as though it's its own little vertex, and you can set where it's going to end the gradient. So right now, what this point is illustrating, or what this is symbolizing, is that this is the start of the gradient and this is white. And so you see anywhere else in the object that is above that, since we're working with a vertical gradient, is white. So there's no gradient that's happening above that. And then the only gradient is happening along the height of this bar. So I can make this bar smaller by continuing to transform it, using it as a point. I can move this around, I think, by selecting the vertex of the starting area, and then I can also rotate it by hovering over the cursor over the end point, and then it gives you this rotation. So let me undo that. So where does this gradient start? I'm going to just start it here. I'm just going to start with a simple gradient. And for this exercise, it's okay if you want to simplify some of these design elements. We're really just looking for them to be separated out. So you have the image element, you have the icons, and the logo element, and then you have this background element. So, and that's what we're working with here. So let's see, I want this to come down here, and let's see, it looks like that's a pretty short gradient actually. So let me drag this up a little bit more and then bring this down here. Okay, so the other thing that you are going to want to do with these probably is set the colors. And the way to do that is there's a couple of different methods. I tend to work with what's easiest and most intuitive to myself. So I will select that gradient or that object that has that gradient applied to it, and you can see that it has that gradient applied to it because the object itself is selected, and then you can look over here in the palette and you see, oh, this is a different kind of fill. It's not one color. And the same thing here. the CMYK, there's no sliders here because you are working with the gradient. So I'm going to actually open up the gradient tab, which is right here. And now I'm able to have a little bit better control over the gradient itself. And this is, in order to be able to utilize this, you want to be using this tab. If it's not in your right-hand toolbar, you can always go up to Window and then make sure that you have gradient selected. All right, so I want to change this white color because I'm not blending from white to black. I'm blending from a dark gray to a slightly lighter gray. So I'm wanting to start off by selecting a new color to fit here. So I am going to, so you can double click on these tools and then that will actually give you a starting color to work with. And so you can see because I'm working with because I'm just working with gray, it immediately just gives you the K, which is the black of CMYK, and that is how you're going to control the gray. And in this situation, I'm actually going to be starting off darker, and then I can come over here, and then I can set that to be a little bit lighter. And so now I'm getting something, and let me move this over here so you can see, I'm getting something that is a little bit closer matched to the actual background, the base image that I'm starting with here. And if I wanted to work with this further, I can change, if you wanted to add in color, you can always go up to the CMYK option, and then you can start adding in color. And so in this situation, I see that this has a little bit of brown in it, so I'm going to add a little bit of yellow here and a little bit of magenta, so I can try and approximate a little bit of that brown tone. And then I can go over here and do the same thing. So I'm wanting to start off with a slightly richer gray, so I'm adding in these different tones. So this to me seems like a good enough approximation. I'm working with these gradients. I have this background element created, and that's probably about as far as I'm going to ask people to be going for this exercise. So a couple of little extra things though. If you're trying to match a very specific color, there are a couple things you can do, and unfortunately, I have not been able to figure out how to pull out a color when you're in the middle of the gradient tool, but there is a way to apply colors that you've already used, the eyedropper tool to pull out, and then apply those to the gradient dialog box. So I'm going to try and show that next. But if this is enough of a challenge, that's fine. For this assignment, you're not needing to go any further, but I do want to show people how to do that if they're interested. So let's say that I wanted to get an exact match of that base image or that starting image, that inspiration image that I'm working with. So I'm trying to do this here. Hold on. So I'm actually going to just make two quick objects to then apply. I'm going to use these little squares that I've just drawn as essentially swatches. So I'm going to select one. I'm going to hit the eyedropper tool, which is the hotkey I. And then I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to click somewhere pretty close to the end of that gradient. And then I'm going to select the next object, and I'm going to click over here, which is that starting point of that gradient. So now I have these two colors pulled out. So if I want to apply this to this gradient that I have applied to this rectangle, which is going to be the background of my user interface design, I can then, I think this is going to work. Let's see. I'm going to drag this and let's see here. Going to drag this. Gonna hit I. Oh, maybe I just need to hit I. Oh, no, that doesn't work. No, that does work. Okay, great. Okay, so just a little experimentation, trying to remember how to use these tools. So the way that I just did that is I selected that first little, and that's how you make a gradient with 3 different points of gradation, which I can show next. I made sure to select that one slider, so that's showing that starting color, and then I hit the eyedropper tool, and then I went over here and I held down Shift, and I selected that starting color. And so what that does, instead of just applying that fill color to the entire object, It's just applying that fill color to the little slider that I have selected. And then to get this other swatch applied to the ending gradient, I'm going to select that. I'm going to hit I to select the eyedropper tool. I'm going to hold down Shift, and then I'm going to click this, and now this is very closely matched to here. And just to maybe show this a little bit, it's probably really hard to tell what I just did, or that it actually did anything, because these were already pretty well matched. So just to show that again, and this is just to show an example, I'm not going to actually be having this be this blue, but let's say, for example, this, let me pull open the gradient tab again. So let's say that this gradation actually ended with this blue swatch and not this lighter gray. So I'm wanting to apply that to the gradient, but I don't really know how to do that. So I have this swatch already, so I'm going to hold down this gradient slider, and then I'm going to go over here, and while I have Shift, because if I don't hold down Shift, it will just apply that to the entire object. But if I hold down Shift, it's then just applying it to the single slider that I selected. No. Oh, that's because I exited out. Okay, so I'm selecting that again. I'm holding down, I'm pressing I to get the eyedropper tool. I'm holding down Shift, and then I'm applying that to the last step of the gradation. And you can also do this with images. So I still have this last little slider selected. I'm going to hold down I, and then I'm going to hold down Shift. Again, it's very important to hold down Shift, because if you don't, it'll just apply the single color that you are isolating using this eyedropper tool to the entire object. But if you're holding down Shift and you've made sure to select one of these slider icons, then you're only going to be applying that tone, or sorry, that swatch or that pixel value to this specific slider. So I'm holding down Shift, and then this is going to make that into that yellow. So you can see how this does give you some abilities to really fine-tune these gradients. And the last thing I want to show, let's say that this was going, and this actually is, so this, and let me quickly go back here. So this background is a 3-point gradient. It's going from a slightly bluer gray to this brown gray, and then to this lighter brown gray. So this is a third tone here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this third tone. So first, to add this third tone, which is going to be, when you're looking at something that is vertical, it's going to be to the left of this slider. So I'm going to move this slider over, and then I'm going to, when I hover my cursor over this spot where it's not over one of these particular sliders, it comes up with this little plus, and that will actually allow you to add another point in the gradient. You can't tell that I just added something here because it is the same tone. It defaults to be the same tone that it is within the gradient histogram here. So, but you can do the same thing. I'm just selecting this single tone. I'm pressing I to get my eyedropper tool. I'm holding down Shift, and then I'm going over here. And this is just to illustrate, but this will turn it to blue. And you see, now the reason why this is happening is because that center point, or that starting point for the gradient, is right here. So it's really only showing this gradient at the bottom half of the image. So I'm also going to have to adjust that. But let's get this to be the right color first. So I'm going to go up here, pressing I to get my eyedropper tool. I'm holding down Shift. I'm going to pull this out. All right, so now I have the 3-point gradient that I'm trying to develop for this background. And the last thing I need to do is I need to edit this so that it's extending the entire length of my object. So I'm going to extend this. I'm going to bring this all the way up, first of all. And then, so now I have this starting here, and then I'm also going to extend the length. So I'm going to pull down that little vertex. So now this is extending the entire length of my background object, which is just this fill that's applied to this gradient fill that's applied to this rectangle. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change these sliders, the position of the sliders, so not the values of the sliders, but the position of them, to reflect the gradient proportions that are shown here. So in this example, it looks like it starts to go to brown around the, I don't know, probably like 1/3 mark. So these are going to be more in thirds. So, and then that looks like it's a little bit too blue, so I'm just going to move this blue up. And then it looks like this gradient is actually a little bit faster happening than this gradient, so I'm going to move these two sliders together. And so now you can see how this layout here, it correlates to the length of the gradient and the distance between one value of the gradient and another value of the gradient. So it's actually changing the amount of gradation that's happening and the length of the gradation. And that is just in proportion to the overall size of the gradient itself. So this is a little bit confusing because I started off with it only being about half the length of the object because I was just worried about the gradient change that was happening from the midpoint down to the bottom of the object. But then in order to work with the entire object, I had to then extend this gradient to be able to fit the entire length of the object. So lots of things to go over. Don't worry if you got to that first step and you have a gradient that has these two different values, that's fine. But for those of you that wanted to pull out more specific values potentially from your inspiration image or from your base image, or if you were wanting to develop a gradient that had more than two values, this is how you go about and do that. So make sure to save and then move on to the next step.